Hi everyone, I'm Bhante Sujato and I'm here with Buddhist Futures Part 2. And so today we're going to be talking about the Buddhist futures, or the futures that are actually here now. Now, last session I talked about the futures of the Buddha, and the futures of the Buddha are the futures that are envisaged or depicted in the Buddhist texts. And one of the things that we learned by looking at that was that the Buddha did not have a fatalistic idea of what the future was going to be. For him, the future was all about cause and effect. So how we behave now is what creates the future. So there's a famous saying by, I believe it was by the cyberpunk pioneer William Gibson, who said the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And this is a really, I think, quite a profound saying, very insightful, and I want to take that up as the theme of this talk today and to sort of look at this from a few different angles. The most obvious way of reading what Gibson said was to think of, in terms of the technology, the science, the possibilities that the future opens up, and to realize the fact that the things that we use and take for granted every day, for many people, are science fiction. Of course, Gibson was talking in the 80s, and things have changed a lot since then, but the basic idea is still here, and perhaps even more so. When we use something like a smartphone or a computer, or all of the things that we get used to many of the people in the world, then these are completely incomprehensible devices, just like magic. We live in a world where we're so overwhelmed by information that the sheer quantity of information is itself the issue, and how do we filter that out and how do we reduce it? I was just reading this morning, because of course we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I was reading about the state of the Rohingya people in Cox's Bazar, refugees from the genocide that happened in Myanmar, and they're now staying in these camps, and they've got nothing. They've got no food, no nothing, and certainly no internet connection or mobile connection. Governments shut all those things off for them. So they have no idea what's going on, and they certainly don't have any idea about social distancing, or all of the things that for us have become so common that they get boring. So for us, we live in this future from their perspective. We live in this future that's incredible and desirable and sparkling and magic. From our perspective, that same future is already worn. We already get blasé about smartphones. We don't bother about updating our next smartphone next year, because the next one's going to be pretty much the same as this one. We're not really that interested in it. So the way that the world is now, that where we are situated in regards to the future, is very different depending on where we are. Now, it's not just the good things in the future that are unevenly distributed, but also, if we flip it around, it's also the fears and the dangers in the future which are also unevenly distributed. If we think in terms of climate change, then clearly climate change is affecting different parts of the world in different ways, and climate change and environmental devastation more generally will impact not just to different degrees, but to different kinds. And in certain places there's suffering from drought, in other places suffering from floods, in certain places there's too much rain, in certain places not enough rain, and so on. And so when we look today at the collapsing of the Antarctic ice sheets, or the flooding in Mozambique, or the plagues of locusts across southern Africa, or the hurricanes in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, or the on and on it goes, the bushfires in Australia, that's the future. That's the future of our planet, and these are messengers of the future which are coming here to warn us, much like the signs, the four signs, who came to the Bodhisattva to warn him of the inevitability of aging, sickness and death. And so we're getting all of these signs. The portents and signs in our days are not told through mythology and stories, they're told through scientific reports. IPCC special report is now the is the revelations of our time. So the future is here unevenly. It's here evenly in both the good parts of the future, the exciting parts, and also through the scary parts and the devastating parts, and everything in between. So I'd just like to sort of briefly touch on Buddhist philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy of time here. Now, the Buddha, of course, didn't personally articulate a theory of time, but the understanding of time is something which I believe permeates the Buddha's philosophy. And if I was to sum that up, I would say the Buddha's philosophy of time is that time is a concept which is derived from our memory of the changes in experience. I'll say that again. Time is a concept which is derived from our memory of changes in experience. Let me just explain what I mean by that. So first thing is that the Buddha, when it comes to physical quantities like time, the Buddha didn't look to the external world in the same way that modern science does, but he looked inside. And so understanding of the world is primarily driven by understanding of awareness. And for the Buddha, that was where truth lay, because any information that we get through the senses and through measurements and experience is always subject to the flaws of rationality. But what we actually experience in our hearts is something that we can see for ourselves. So time is seen from the inside. Now, when we see time from the inside, what do we see? Well, obviously, it's about consciousness. It's about awareness and it's about experience, because that's the stuff of our interior world. This is what we're talking about. Now, but that consciousness can't stay still. Consciousness by its very nature must change. This is what we mean when we talk about impermanence. Impermanence doesn't just mean that things happen to change. It means that it's their nature to change because they're conditioned. So consciousness is always changing. So it's the changes in consciousness. If consciousness were not to change, then our experience would be one where time is suspended. And that's actually quite a good description of what happens in deep states of samadhi. So if one enters a deep state of samadhi into a jhana, then change stops, or at the very least, becomes almost stops within that state. And time is suspended. And this is why the mystics will describe that kind of state as being something like an eternal now, or an eternal present. There's no past and there's no future, there's only the now, and that now is still and unchanging. So this is one of the meanings of samadhi when we talk about these deep and these profound states of meditation. This is why the practice of these things is so fundamental and so transformative, because it's not just getting a bit of peace of mind, it's transforming the whole way we experience time. Now, if you haven't experienced that kind of state, then you still will have experienced that kind of change in time, at least to a little degree, because each time we meditate, we're slowing down the changes in our mind and slowing down our experience of time. And I'm sure you've all had that experience of when you're meditating and you don't realize how long the time's gone, especially if you're on retreat. Our perception of time gets warped. It's because our consciousness is changing. The rate of change of our consciousness is changing. But time is not something that can be inferred or derived merely from the changes in consciousness. Why? Well, think about it. If you have something which is at point A, and then something which is at point B, how do you know that when it's at point B, how do you know it has been in the past at point A? It's changed its position. How do we know that? Well, in the mind, the way that we know that is through memory. Memory is the thing that allows us to know that something has changed. And so memory, or sati, provides a stream, a thread of continuity that links up the past, the present, and the future. And through that, we're able to bear things in mind, we'll be able to understand the changes that's going on and be able to infer the idea of time from that. So this is why I say, again, to come to that definition, that time is a concept which is derived from our memory of the changes in experience. Now, in modern-day Buddhism, and especially in Abhidhamma-derived Buddhism, people like to talk about the present moment, the Pali term being Paccuppanna Khanna. Curiously enough, there's no mention of such a present moment in the Buddha's teachings. And in fact, there's no mention of the idea of moments, and especially mind moments, at all in the Buddha's teachings. And I find the idea of moments to be very problematic. Time isn't something that just happens at a point, and time and consciousness are processes which involve the interactions of many complex systems, and those things must take time to happen. And in that way we can see there's not really any such thing as the present. So for example, I'll just give you some examples of this. And I say I'm sitting here in this room, and the light that you're seeing now is a light which is reflected off me, and that light is coming from the lights we have in this room. And that takes time. The light takes time from those light bulbs to reach me, to be reflected off my skin, to go to the camera. All of these are processes that take time. For us to see that is also a process that takes time. The light impacts our eyeballs, we have to process it through our brain and so on. And our brain is a big network of things. And sure, one part of our brain is going to communicate with another part of our brain quickly, but it doesn't happen at the same time. So conscious experience is something which has to be assembled from a vast range of complex information. And that's a process which by its nature is somewhat blurry and somewhat smudgy. And that's how we experience time, right? We experience time as kind of elastic. The present moment isn't something that's very sort of sharply and clearly defined. It's inherently smudgy. It's more like a probability curve than it is like a point. And so what that means is that William Gibson's phrase about the future being unevenly distributed is something which applies not just in a social sense, but also in our own consciousness. Right? Do you see the point here? That actually what we're experiencing now is an unevenly distributed present. And that can be blurry as well, and we can be getting information from what we think of as the past and the future, and we can be combining that in our brain, and we're sort of cooking up the present, which is again a concept, something which is derived from experience. The things that we're experiencing are not the present. The things we're experiencing are only relatively close to the present, like sight, sound, smell, taste and touch remain close to the present. But actually, when you look at it very closely, it's different. And they each involve processing that happens over time. Consider, say, taste as another example in the senses. You can't experience a taste in an instant or in a moment. Taste involves the assimilation and the metabolization of, not metabolization, the reaction of chemicals when you eat. Salt and sugar and all of these kinds of things. And that takes time. It's a physical process. Activating the sense buds, the taste buds in your mouth, takes time. And so what we experience as being in the present, in fact, is something which is rather blurry and rather smeared. So time is rather more like a smear of probability than it is an instant or a moment. So the present is here, it's just unevenly distributed. The good parts of the present are here, the bad parts of the present are here. The past is also present in each of us. And through that, the future which we are creating is also here with us in the present. Of course, it's true that we can't just determine the future. Of course, there are things that will happen in the future that can't be, that we can't affect or we can't change. But we can change some things. And we can certainly change our own attitudes and our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own consciousness and our behavior. And by doing that, then we can certainly change that of people around us a little bit, and perhaps even on a broader scale. Now, I want to indulge in a little bit of my own reminiscing here and give a brief story of my own personal future. Because my personal futures have shaped who I am now. And in shaping who I am now, they're shaping what I'm talking about, and they're shaping the futures that I'm creating for myself. And it's no secret that I was a great science fiction geek when I was a kid. And I used to devour science fiction books constantly. Mostly books in those days. We didn't have so much science fiction on the movies and TV. I remember when I was a kid, my parents were divorced, and my sister and I used to stay with my dad on the weekends. And every weekend we would go to the second-hand bookshop and trade in last week's books and get some new books. And I would always go straight to the science fiction section and trade in last week's ones and get a whole bunch of new science fiction books, which I would then devour for that week. And that was how it would pretty much go. I guess one of the most influential, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention a few of the key points in how some of my personal influences on the future. Now, perhaps one of the I'm wanting to say foundational, but that would be bad because the name of the book is Foundation. So one of the fundamental books is the book series called Foundation by Isaac Asimov. It's very kind of classical science fiction. Asimov was a scientist and a writer on popular science, and also a very famous science fiction writer. And he wrote about robots, and he wrote about space exploration and so on. And his sort of grandest vision was of a society in the far, far future where there was a galactic empire which was crumbling and falling apart. So humanity had reached out to the stars, we had conquered, we had triumphed, we had built this empire, and now that empire was falling apart. Culturally, of course, influenced by the fall of the Roman Empire, which was a part of historical education in those days, and by the collapse, the then contemporary collapse in the 50s of the British Empire and the experience of colonialism worldwide. Now, as the empire was collapsing, there was a scientist called Hari Seldon. And Hari Seldon developed a science called psychohistory, by which he claimed to be able to predict the future course of humanity based on the fact that while humans as individuals are quite unpredictable, humans as a mass are entirely predictable. And in fact, he claimed to be able to predict the future evolution of humanity for thousands, if not millions of years in the future. And he set up an organization called the Foundation, whose role, though somewhat enigmatic, was to shepherd humanity through the collapse of the empire, which he saw as inevitable, and to create a better universe in the future. And so this version of history of the future, as painted by Asimov, is one which is very optimistic. It's one which where Asimov as a writer is in a way obviously represented by Hari Seldon in the book, in the sense that there's a confidence in being able to predict those long futures, to be able to say that in the I think it was the 1950s he wrote this, it might have been the 40s, that in that time that the progress it's seen in terms of technology and society and industry would be something that would continue, and that humanity would continue to thrive in the future. Now, obviously, from our modern point of view, we might say that there are a lot of things which are quite naive about that. I mean, for example, it sort of strangely seems that the future was dominated by straight white men who ran the show, which perhaps was a lack of foresight on Asimov's part. But still, or maybe not. Maybe he saw how things really will be. But anyway, the basic point here is that there is a fundamental assumption that we can know what the future is derived from what we choose in the present. And that's not dissimilar to what the Buddha taught, that our choices in the present can choose what we can see in the future. Sometime later, that kind of vision of the future became harder to sustain. In the early 60s, the most influential science fiction book was Dune. And Dune was an ecological science fiction book. And Dune began with the experience of Frank Herbert by surveying the sand dunes of southern United States and looking at their behavior. And he wrote an extraordinary novel on a worldwide ecosystem that was dominated by these dunes. And so what he looked at there was not just our ability to conquer and to conquest, but also the fact that no matter where we go, humanity will always be intrinsically and intimately bound up with the ecological reality of the worlds on which we find ourselves. And that's something which has not been a feature of earlier science fiction. Other science fiction writers, like Ursula Le Guin, for example, in her The Name for World is Forest, looked at how our colonization attempts could fall into that same trap of brutalizing the native and indigenous people in the worlds that we conquered, disrespecting the nature and so on, and that this would be a future where the same mistakes that we had made on Earth would be then replicated throughout the galaxy. And it's interesting that in her work, for example, she explicitly connected that with vegetarianism, that those on Earth would be eating soybeans and those on the colonies would be free to eat meat, and that this was kind of part of that brutalizing process. Time went on and horizons kind of shrank, and our ability to imagine that future in that kind of way as a positive or negative force began to diminish. In the late 70s, of course, we had Star Wars, and for me as a kid, this is an overwhelming experience. I don't know if it's possible to really say how that affects you, and you've never seen anything like that before, and then suddenly all of those dreams and fantasies and stories that you've read are just there in what at the time was extraordinarily kind of vivid colour. But the most important thing about Star Wars is that it began by saying a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And in many ways, the vision of the galaxy that George Lucas put on screen was derived from or influenced by the world building by Isaac Asimov. The idea of a huge galaxy-spanning empire and so on. And yet, George Lucas was no longer able to imagine that this was an inevitable outcome of our civilization. It was something other, something else. And we're beginning to fail to be able to see a far future. And then come the 1980s, and the defining stories were much closer to home. Blade Runner depicted a future only a few decades away, where the world is dominated by giant corporations, and the benefits of the future of all of the magic that the early science fiction writers had dreamed of, flying cars and robots and artificial intelligence, all of that was no longer something which humanity had to reckon with. It's something which was owned by corporations. The future had been privatized. So the future is shrinking, it's coming closer, and it's becoming darker and more unequal, and it's becoming privatized. This, of course, in the 1980s with the rise of neoliberalism, Reaganomics, Thatcheronomics, and so on. And so we enter into the era where it becomes harder and harder to envisage a future that is bright and optimistic and positive, and easier to envisage a future where the good things of the present can be developed and enjoyed by the smaller and smaller groups of the ultra-wealthy, while the masses will be sunk into a more and more moribund reality. I don't know about you, but I think that vision of the future hasn't really changed very much, and I think that insofar as this is a prediction, is turning out to be, I don't think we've seen anything on a large scale to really question that this is the direction that things are going. We, as human beings, have made our choices. We've decided to live our lives in certain ways, and in living our lives in certain ways, we've decided, we've created outcomes for what the future will be. We, as the scope of science fiction shrank, and I don't mean to pretend in any way that this is a full survey of the field, but it's just like some things that have been influential in my life as I've grown up. And as that shrinking, and then our imagination of the possibilities of what kind of world we could live in are also shrinking. Imagine what would happen if all of the things that we have around us, if these incredible transformations could be used for good instead of being used to enrich corporations. During the time that I've been giving this talk, the scant half an hour I've been doing this talk, the world's richest billionaires, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and so on, they've earned more money in this half an hour than you or I will ever see in our entire lives. And inequality is not going away, it's growing. It's growing while we're listening to this. And so that future which we're building is a future that we are creating right now. We seem to have this almost religious devotion to the idea that the future progress will be able to solve problems. But one of the problems with that idea is that we become fixated by the new, by the change. Think about it. This is how consciousness works. I mentioned before about how consciousness is based on change. And when things are still and stable in consciousness, you don't pay attention anymore. This is why samadhi is so hard. And when something changes, your mind is drawn to that. But that's what's happening right now. Your attention right now is being fixed to a screen. Your eyes are fixated on that, your ears are on that, you're employing the technology of the internet. You right now are focusing as much as you can on precisely the newest and the latest and the most futuristic thing that's around you. That's how consciousness works. But then stop that. Look around. Actually, that technology is only a small part of this world that I'm inhabiting and that you're inhabiting as well. I'm sitting here on carpet. Carpet's been the same since I was a kid. It hasn't changed. We have brick walls behind us. Bricks haven't changed. There's cloth. Cloth hasn't changed. There are doors. Doors haven't changed. They're just the same. Lights. Okay, lights have changed a bit. Wooden boxes, cloth, chairs, clothes. Most of these things haven't really changed because of technology. If they have changed, it's only in small details, Maybe the manufacturing process has changed or something like that, but the actual things themselves haven't really changed all that much. Most of the things that we see around us actually don't change. And technology is not something that's a universal panacea for everything. It's good for certain kinds of things. Yes, if I want to transmit a visual image from one place to another, information technology is great for that. But if I want to build a house, how actually useful is it? I can build a house with, the Egyptians built the pyramids. They didn't have information technology. So our hopes as invested in this one thing, information technology, which has changed and developed at such an incredible rate. And we kind of have this naive assumption that everything else is going to change and develop because of that. But it isn't going to. It hasn't and it won't. Because IT isn't good for all of those things. And the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar aren't going to be helped by information technology. They're not going to be helped by our science fiction future. They're going to be helped by some common decency. They're going to be helped by people not treating them as outcasts. They're going to be helped by compassion. And the real things that will really make a difference for the future as for today are the things that define humanity. that's our choice. How are we going to define our humanity? Is our humanity going to be something that is small and mean? Are we going to give up? Is our humanity going to be something that just is content to have and get more shiny things? Is that our humanity? Or is our humanity going to be defined by our compassion, by our wisdom, by our ability to not be trapped and distracted by the baubles and the shiny things that we see around us? And we have a choice. We have a choice how we live our lives. We have a choice which of the futures that we see inside ourselves, which of the futures that we see in the world around us are going to manifest. Which of those futures are going to become a reality? This is our choice. So this is my talk for you today on the futures that we see in the present. I hope this has been entertaining for you and hopefully even instructive, and I look forward to having some discussion with you about that. And see you next week for the third installment of this series.